The puppy should not have understood that command. The storm rolled across northern Montana like a living thing, dragging cold rain against the windows of Broken Pines Animal Shelter just after midnight. The old building groaned beneath the wind. Water tapped steadily through a leak in the ceiling near the supply closet, and somewhere in the dark hallway, a loose metal sign clinked softly with every gust. Inside the emergency care room, the air smelled of antiseptic, wet fur, and fading heat from an overworked radiator struggling to survive the freezing night. Ethan Calloway stood near the operating table, holding a flashlight in one hand and a worn military jacket in the other. At 37, Ethan still carried the posture of a Marine, broad shoulders, steady hands, eyes trained to notice danger before it arrived. But exhaustion had settled into him over the years like winter settling into old wood. His short brown hair was damp from rain, and faint shadows rested permanently beneath his pale hazel eyes. He had not slept through a full night in nearly 4 years. Not since Afghanistan. Not since the dogs. Nova lay trembling beneath the dim emergency lamp, her sable German shepherd coat soaked from the storm. Mud streaked her legs. A faded scar crossed her right shoulder beneath thinning fur, and her breathing came unevenly, fragile but stubborn. The shelter had found her 3 days earlier wandering near Highway 89 with no collar and no microchip. Heavily pregnant and terrified of every human who came too close. Every human except Ethan. Dr. Claire Bennett moved quickly beside the table, sleeves rolled to her elbows, silver strands escaping from her dark blonde ponytail. Her calm voice cut gently through the storm. "Easy, girl, easy now." Another contraction hit. Nova whimpered softly but never snapped, never panicked. She only searched the room with wide amber eyes until they found Ethan standing near the wall. Then her breathing slowed again. Outside, thunder rolled low over the mountains. The lights flickered once, twice. Ethan tightened his grip on the flashlight. "Generator's acting up again," he muttered. Claire nodded without looking away from Nova. "Just keep the light steady." The first puppy arrived moments later, tiny and wet and barely moving. Claire cleared its airway carefully and wrapped it in a towel. For one terrible second, the room fell silent except for rain hammering against the roof. Ethan felt that familiar hollow feeling open inside his chest, the same cold emptiness he remembered from battlefield tents and military hospitals. Then the puppy inhaled sharply. A weak cry filled the room. Claire smiled with relief. "There you go, little guy." Ethan stepped closer without thinking. The puppy squirmed in Claire's hands, restless despite being only seconds old. Instinctively, Ethan lowered his voice into the calm command tone he had once used overseas. "Stay." The puppy froze instantly, completely still. Claire stopped breathing. Ethan stared down at the tiny shepherd in disbelief. Its eyes were still sealed shut, its ears folded flat against its head. It should not have recognized language. It should not have understood tone. But somehow, impossibly, it obeyed. A cold silence settled over the room. Then Claire slowly pulled back the towel covering the puppy's chest. Beneath the damp fur rested a small white marking shaped almost perfectly like a cross. Claire's face lost all color. Her fingers trembled slightly. Ethan noticed immediately. "What is it?" he asked quietly. Claire didn't answer at first. She only stared at the puppy as though she had seen a ghost step out of the storm. Finally, barely above a whisper, she spoke. "Oh my God. Valor." Ethan frowned. "Who's Valor?" Before Claire could answer, headlights appeared through the rain outside the shelter windows, long beams cutting across the darkness of the parking lot. Nova suddenly lifted her head and growled for the first time. The growl that came from Nova did not sound fearful. It sounded protective. Ethan turned toward the rain-covered windows as the headlights stopped outside the shelter entrance. For a brief second, the beams cut through the darkness of the emergency room, throwing long pale shadows across the walls. Nova struggled weakly on the table, her body trembling from exhaustion, but her eyes stayed locked on the parking lot. Another puppy whimpered beside her. Claire carefully wrapped the newborn in a dry towel while trying to steady her breathing. Ethan noticed the way her hands still shook. "You know something?" he said quietly. Claire swallowed hard without looking up. "I knew a military dog once. Years ago." Thunder rolled again over the mountains, rattling the old windows in their frames. The storm outside had deepened, Thick freezing rain mixed now with sleet that hissed against the roof like static. Ethan moved toward the hallway, instinctively alert in the way old Marines never truly stop being. His boots echoed softly against cracked tile floors while the scent of bleach and wet pine drifted through the shelter vents. Halfway down the corridor, the backup generator flickered. The lights dimmed low enough for the entire building to hold its breath. Then came 3 slow knocks at the front door. Not loud, not urgent. Somehow worse because of how calm they sounded. Ethan froze near the reception desk. Nova's growl carried faintly from the back room again. Low. Warning. Protective. He glanced through the narrow glass beside the entrance. 2 men stood beneath the leaking awning outside. Dark jackets. Baseball caps pulled low against the storm. One carried a metal pet crate in gloved hands. The taller man lifted his head slightly when he noticed movement inside. Shelter is closed. Ethan called through the door. The man outside offered a thin smile that never reached his eyes. We are not here for the shelter, he replied. His voice was smooth, controlled. We are looking for a German shepherd. Ethan felt tension settle into his shoulders immediately. You got the wrong place. The second man stepped forward slightly. Black sable female. Recently gave birth. Silence followed. Rainwater dripped steadily from the edge of the roof. Somewhere behind Ethan, the old building creaked in the wind. The taller man spoke again. That dog belongs to us. Ethan did not answer right away. Years earlier, before deployments and funerals and sleepless nights, he had learned something important about danger. Real danger rarely shouted. It spoke softly, politely. You should leave, Ethan finally said. The man's expression hardened almost invisibly. Then he glanced past Ethan toward the hallway leading deeper into the shelter. You do not understand what those puppies are. Ethan stepped closer to the glass. Neither do you. Another flash of lightning illuminated the parking lot in cold white light. For the briefest moment, Ethan noticed a faded military decal on the side of their black SUV. It had been partially scraped away, but enough remained to tighten something deep inside his chest. K9 Tactical Recovery Unit. Old government contractor program. Discontinued years ago. Or at least that was what the news had claimed. The taller man lowered his voice. Those bloodlines were never supposed to survive. Behind Ethan, Nova suddenly barked once. Sharp. Desperate. Then came another sound from the emergency room. Claire shouting his name. Ethan turned immediately and sprinted down the hallway. One of the puppies had crawled free from the blanket somehow, tiny legs dragging weakly across the metal table toward Nova's chest. Claire looked pale with disbelief. Ethan, she whispered. Watch this. The puppy pressed against Nova's side for only a second before lifting its tiny head toward the emergency room doorway. Its sealed eyes remained closed, but its body stiffened, listening, waiting. Then, from outside the shelter, came the faint crunch of footsteps approaching the back entrance through the snow and rain. The newborn puppy released a low growl. The sound coming from the newborn puppy did not belong to something only minutes old. It was low and controlled, barely louder than breathing, yet every hair along Ethan's arms rose beneath his jacket. Snow and freezing rain rattled against the back windows while Nova struggled to push herself upright on the table. Her body was weak from labor, but instinct burned fiercely in her amber eyes now. She was no longer afraid. She was guarding. Claire carefully lifted the tiny puppy back toward the blankets. But the moment her hands touched him, he turned his head toward the rear hallway again and released another warning growl. That is impossible, Claire whispered under her breath. Ethan stared toward the dark corridor leading to the supply entrance at the rear of the shelter. His military instincts had already begun measuring distance, exits, movement, timing. He remembered nights overseas when trained dogs sensed danger long before human eyes could. The best handlers trusted the dog before the radar, before the radio, before command itself. Outside the back hallway door came the faint metallic click of someone testing the handle. Nova barked sharply. The other puppies stirred beside her, tiny bodies shifting beneath the towels. Then something happened that made Ethan stop breathing for a moment. One by one, the newborn puppies fell silent at exactly the same time. No crying, no restless movement, just stillness. Listening. The room seemed to tighten around them. Claire slowly removed her gloves, her expression pale beneath the dim emergency lights. I saw this once before, she said quietly. Ethan glanced toward her without taking his eyes off the hallway. With Valor. Claire nodded slowly. Rainwater dripped from the edge of her sleeves onto the tile floor. He was not ordinary, even as a puppy. The trainers used to joke he understood commands before he could walk properly. Her voice softened with memory. During deployment, he saved 14 Marines over 3 years. Explosives, missing patrols, ambush warnings. Sometimes he reacted before there was anything visible to detect. Ethan frowned. And Nova is connected to him. Claire looked toward the exhausted mother dog curled protectively around her litter. Not connected, she whispered. I think she is his daughter. Another sound echoed from the back entrance. This time closer. The soft scrape of boots against concrete. Ethan moved immediately. He grabbed the old aluminum mop handle leaning near the sink and stepped into the hallway. His heart beat calm in the strange way it always became during danger. The overhead lights flickered weakly above him, buzzing with unstable power. Halfway down the corridor, he noticed the rear door had opened slightly. Cold air slipped inside, carrying the scent of pine, wet snow, and diesel fuel from the SUV outside. Ethan tightened his grip. Shelter is closed, he called firmly into the darkness. Silence answered him at first. Then a voice emerged softly from outside. You do not understand what those puppies were bred for. Ethan stepped closer to the door, but kept his body angled carefully. And I do not think you understand they are not yours anymore. The storm wind howled through the narrow opening. Somewhere behind Ethan, one of the puppies suddenly barked. Not whimpered. Barked. Clear. Sharp. Impossible. The man outside went completely silent. Then Ethan heard it. Footsteps retreating quickly through the snow. He pushed the door wider just enough to glimpse dark figures disappearing toward the black SUV, parked beyond the trees. Its headlights flicked on again through the storm. But before the vehicle pulled away, Ethan noticed something in the rear seat through the rain-covered glass. Another German Shepherd. Older. Watching the shelter without moving. The older German Shepherd inside the SUV never barked. He only watched. Rain streaked across the dark window as the vehicle disappeared beyond the trees, its red taillights fading slowly into the storm like dying embers. Ethan stood in the freezing wind for another moment, listening to the silence left behind. Something about that dog unsettled him more than the men themselves. There had been recognition in its eyes. Not fear. Not aggression. Recognition. He slowly closed the rear door and slid the deadbolt into place. The old shelter groaned softly around him as another wave of sleet rattled against the roof. When he returned to the emergency room, the heat felt thinner somehow, as if the cold had followed him inside. Nova lay curled protectively around her puppies now, her breathing weaker but calmer. The tiny newborns pressed against her chest beneath folded towels while the emergency lamp cast a warm golden glow across their damp fur. Claire sat motionless beside the table, staring at the white cross marking on the first puppy's chest. Her expression had changed. It no longer looked like shock alone. It looked like grief returning after years of silence. Ethan leaned against the counter quietly. Tell me about Valor. Claire remained silent for several seconds while thunder rolled far out in the mountains. Finally, she spoke softly, almost as though she were afraid the puppies themselves might understand. He saved my life outside Kandahar in 2014. Ethan watched her carefully. Claire folded her trembling hands together. Our convoy had stopped near a collapsed road outside a village. Everything looked clear. The radios were quiet. But Valor refused to move. Her eyes drifted toward Nova. He stood in front of the vehicle and started growling exactly like these puppies did tonight. Ethan felt the room grow colder around him. Claire continued. 30 seconds later, the team discovered explosives buried beneath the road ahead. If Valor had not stopped us, she shook her head slowly, none of us would have survived. The puppies stirred softly against Nova's side as Claire spoke. One tiny shepherd pressed closer against his mother's fur, while another lifted its head weakly toward Claire's voice. Ethan noticed it again. Listening. Reacting. What happened to Valor? He asked quietly. Claire looked down at the floor tiles. Officially? He died during extraction overseas. Her voice tightened slightly. But there were rumors afterward. Contractors. Private buyers. Military breeding programs. Ethan frowned. Breeding programs? Claire nodded slowly. Some people believed certain bloodlines could pass advanced instinct traits naturally. Threat detection. Emotional synchronization. Obedience. She looked toward the puppies again. Most vets thought it was nonsense. Another gust of wind rattled the windows hard enough to make the lights flicker. Nova suddenly lifted her head. Her ears stiffened despite exhaustion. Then she stared directly toward the far wall beside the medicine cabinets. Ethan followed her gaze. At first he saw nothing except shelves of supplies and hanging leashes. Then came a faint sound. Scratching. Very soft. From inside the wall itself. Claire stood immediately. Mice. Ethan shook his head slowly. Too heavy. The scratching stopped. Silence settled again. Then one of the puppies released a tiny bark. Immediately another answered from somewhere beyond the wall. Ethan and Claire froze. Nova let out a low protective rumble deep in her chest. Ethan grabbed the flashlight from the counter and moved toward the back storage room connected to the emergency clinic. The smell of cedar, bleach, and damp cardboard filled the narrow space. Old kennels lined one side of the wall beneath shelves stacked with blankets and pet food. The scratching sound came again. Closer now. Ethan lowered the flashlight beam slowly toward the floor. Behind a pile of unused carriers sat a narrow ventilation grate coated in dust. Two amber eyes reflected back at him from the darkness inside. Ethan stopped breathing for a moment. An older German shepherd stared through the vent silently from the crawl space beneath the shelter. The same dog from the SUV. His muzzle was silver with age. Rainwater clung to his fur. And hanging loosely from his neck was a faded military collar with one word barely visible beneath years of wear. Valor. Valor looked older than death itself. His sable coat, once powerful and thick, had faded into patches of silver and ash gray around his face and shoulders. Rainwater dripped slowly from his whiskers onto the concrete beneath the ventilation shaft, while his amber eyes remained fixed on Ethan with quiet recognition. There was no fear in him, no panic, only exhaustion and purpose. Ethan slowly crouched near the grate, the flashlight trembling faintly in his hand. "Easy, boy," he whispered instinctively. Valor blinked once at the sound of his voice. Behind Ethan, Claire stepped into the storage room and stopped cold the moment she saw the dog. Her breath caught sharply in her throat. For several seconds, she could not move. The storm outside faded beneath the sudden silence inside the shelter. "No," she whispered weakly. "It cannot be him." But deep down, she already knew. Valor shifted slowly inside the narrow crawl space. His movements were stiff with age and old injuries. The faded military collar around his neck hung loosely against his wet fur, scratched and worn from years of survival. Claire knelt beside Ethan carefully, tears already gathering in her eyes. "Valor," she whispered softly, almost like a prayer. The old dog's ears twitched immediately at the sound of his name. Then, despite the tight space, his tail moved once against the darkness behind him. Claire covered her mouth as tears finally escaped down her cheeks. "Oh my God," Ethan glanced toward her. "You are sure?" Claire nodded slowly without taking her eyes off the dog. "I helped train him before deployment." Her voice shook gently now. He used to do that whenever someone spoke calmly near him. One tail movement. Never more. Valor pushed himself closer to the grate with visible effort. Ethan could hear his breathing now, uneven but steady, carrying the faint rasp of old age and cold mountain air. Then something strange happened. One of Nova's puppies barked softly from the emergency room beyond the hallway. Immediately, Valor lifted his head toward the sound. The exhaustion vanished from his eyes for one brief moment, replaced by something softer. Recognition. Family. Claire noticed it too. "He came here for them," she whispered. Ethan slowly reached toward the screws holding the ventilation grate in place. "Help me move this." Minutes later, after wrestling the rusted grate loose with an old wrench from the supply shelf, Ethan carefully widened the opening enough for the old shepherd to crawl free. Valor hesitated only briefly before dragging himself slowly from the darkness beneath the shelter. His paws touched the tile floor carefully, as though he no longer trusted solid ground. Up close, Ethan could see old scars hidden beneath the fur along Valor's ribs and neck. Not fresh wounds. Old survival marks. Years of running, hiding, enduring. Valor stood unsteadily beneath the dim lights for a moment before turning immediately toward the emergency room. His pace was slow but determined. Claire followed silently beside him, unable to stop crying now. Ethan walked behind them through the narrow hallway while the storm howled outside the shelter walls. The moment Valor entered the emergency room, Nova lifted her head from the blankets. Her exhausted body trembled weakly, but the fear vanished completely from her eyes. A soft sound escaped her throat, gentle and broken at the same time. Valor approached the table slowly. The puppies stirred immediately beneath the towels. One tiny newborn pushed itself clumsily toward the edge of the blanket despite barely being able to crawl. Valor rested his muzzle carefully against Nova's forehead. The entire room seemed to exhale. Even the storm outside felt farther away now. Claire wiped tears from her face. All these years, she whispered. They told everyone he was dead. Ethan studied the old shepherd quietly. Maybe someone wanted him forgotten. Valor suddenly stiffened. His ears lifted toward the front of the shelter. The peaceful moment vanished instantly. Ethan heard it a second later. Tires crunching slowly across fresh snow outside the building. More than one vehicle this time. Nova growled weakly beneath her breath, while every puppy fell silent again at once. Then the old shepherd did something Ethan would never forget for the rest of his life. Valor stepped in front of Nova and her newborn puppies like a soldier taking his post one final time. The old shepherd stood so still he almost looked carved from stone. Snowlight from the parking lot windows outlined the silver along Valor's back, while the puppies slept behind him beneath Nova's protective body. Outside, engines rumbled softly through the storm, low and patient, like hunters waiting for the right moment. Ethan moved toward the front hallway carefully, every instinct sharpened now. Valor watched him go without making a sound. The old dog trusted him already. Somehow that mattered more than Ethan could explain. Claire remained beside Nova, gently checking the newborn puppies with trembling hands. One of them had curled itself against Valor's tail while sleeping, tiny paws twitching in dreams not even life had fully begun to understand yet. The shelter lights flickered again. Ethan reached the front office and slowly peeked through the blinds covering the glass entrance. Two black SUVs now sat in the parking lot beneath the falling snow. Their headlights cut through the storm in pale white beams. Three men stood outside near the vehicles speaking quietly among themselves. No uniforms, no badges, just dark winter jackets and the still posture of people used to control. Ethan noticed something else immediately. They were not looking at the shelter entrance. They were watching the windows, waiting for movement inside. One man lifted a flashlight briefly toward the building. The beam swept across the storm before shutting off again. Ethan stepped back into the darkness instinctively. His heartbeat remained steady, but an old familiar pressure settled deep inside his chest. The kind that arrived before missions went wrong. Behind him, the floor creaked softly. Ethan turned. Valor stood silently at the end of the hallway now, watching him. The old shepherd's ears remained fixed toward the parking lot. Then Valor slowly looked toward the electrical panel near the office wall. Ethan frowned slightly. "What is it, boy?" Valor stared at the panel again. Ethan approached it carefully. The old metal box buzzed weakly beneath flickering emergency power. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then he noticed one tiny red blinking light attached beneath the breaker panel itself. Not part of the shelter wiring. Something added later. His stomach tightened immediately. Tracking equipment. Ethan crouched lower, studying the device while snow hissed softly against the windows outside. Claire appeared quietly behind him. "What is that?" she whispered. "How long has this shelter had backup maintenance contractors?" Ethan asked without looking away from the blinking light. Claire shook her head slowly. "We have not had money for contractors in over 2 years." Ethan carefully removed the tiny device from beneath the panel. The blinking stopped instantly. Valor relaxed slightly the moment Ethan held it up. Claire covered her mouth softly. "They tracked her here." Ethan nodded. "Not just Nova." He looked back toward the emergency room where the puppies slept. The bloodline. For a moment nobody spoke. The storm filled the silence around them, carrying the smell of snow and pine through tiny cracks in the old building. Then one of the SUVs outside slowly shut off its headlights. Darkness swallowed half the parking lot immediately. Claire's voice trembled. "What do they want from them?" Ethan stared at the tracker in his hand. Probably the same thing people always want from living things that feel miraculous. Control. A sudden crash echoed from the rear side of the shelter. Metal against concrete. Nova barked sharply from the emergency room. Every puppy woke instantly. Ethan spun toward the sound, but before he could move, Valor was already there. The old shepherd limped down the hallway faster than Ethan thought possible for a dog his age, placing himself between the rear entrance and the room where Nova and the puppies lay hidden. His body shook slightly with exhaustion, but his eyes burned with absolute focus now. Then came another sound through the storm outside. Not engines. Not footsteps. A whistle. Short. Military. Valor's ears twitched immediately, and for the first time since arriving at the shelter, the old dog looked afraid. Valor backed slowly toward the emergency room, never taking his eyes off the rear entrance. The whistle outside had changed him instantly. Fear had entered the old shepherd's body like a memory returning after years buried underground. Ethan noticed the way Valor's breathing quickened, the slight tremble in his injured front leg, the way his ears flattened for the first time all night. This was not fear of pain. It was recognition. Somewhere beyond the storm, someone from Valor's past had arrived. Another whistle echoed through the snow. 2 short bursts this time. Military cadence. Precise. Deliberate. Nova growled low beneath her breath while the puppies shifted restlessly against her chest. One of the newborns let out a tiny bark in response, impossibly alert despite being only hours old. Claire wrapped another blanket around Nova carefully, her hands trembling. "That whistle," she whispered. "I heard it during training exercises overseas." Ethan looked toward her sharply. Claire's face had gone pale again. Handlers used it for recall commands. Only elite K9 units responded to it. The storm lights flickered overhead as wind pressed hard against the shelter walls. Ethan moved toward the rear hallway quietly, gripping the metal flashlight tighter now. "Stay with the dogs," he said softly. But before Claire could answer, Valor stepped in front of Ethan's path. The old shepherd stared directly into his eyes. Then slowly, deliberately, Valor shook his head once. Ethan froze. It was not random movement. It looked intentional. Human almost. "You do not want me opening that door," Ethan murmured quietly. Valor held his gaze without blinking. Then came another sound outside. A different one this time. A faint whine. Dog. Not aggressive. Hurting. Valor immediately turned his head toward the rear entrance. Conflict visible all across his tired face now. Claire stepped closer carefully. Maybe they brought another dog. Ethan frowned. Or maybe they know he will respond to it. Silence settled heavily around them. Then Nova suddenly lifted herself halfway upright despite exhaustion and released a soft bark toward Valor. The old shepherd looked back at her immediately. Whatever passed between them needed no words. Family. Warning. Trust. Ethan slowly exhaled and crouched beside Valor. "Listen to me, old man," he whispered. "Nobody is taking them tonight." Valor stared at him for another long second. Then, slowly, the shepherd stepped aside. Ethan approached the rear hallway cautiously. The cold intensified near the door, carrying the sharp scent of snow and gasoline beneath the constant smell of pine drifting through the mountains outside. He switched off the flashlight before reaching the narrow rear window. Through the frosted glass, he could barely make out shapes moving near the trees behind the shelter. One man stood holding a leash. At the end of it was another German shepherd, younger than Valor. Black sable coat, broad chest, military posture. The dog looked restless, pacing through the snow with anxious energy while the man beside him whispered commands Ethan could not hear through the storm. Then something strange happened. The younger shepherd suddenly stopped pacing. His ears lifted sharply toward the shelter walls. A soft whimper escaped him. Not aggressive. Sad. Ethan narrowed his eyes carefully. The dog was staring toward Valor's position inside the hallway. Recognition. Before Ethan could process the thought fully, Valor moved beside him silently and looked through the same window. The younger dog outside immediately pulled hard against the leash with a desperate cry. His tail wagged violently through the snow. Valor's entire body stiffened. Claire stepped closer behind them, voice barely above a whisper. "That dog knows him." The younger shepherd outside barked once. Then again. The sound echoed through the storm with aching desperation. The handler jerked the leash sharply, but the dog refused to stop staring toward the shelter. Ethan noticed something then. Around the younger shepherd's neck hung the same faded military collar style Valor wore. Same unit markings. Same scratched metal tag. Claire covered her mouth softly. "Oh my God," she whispered. "That is one of his puppies." Valor released the quietest sound Ethan had ever heard from a dog. Not a growl. Not a bark. A broken, exhausted whine that carried years of loss inside it. Then suddenly every newborn puppy in the emergency room began crying at the exact same moment. The newborn puppies cried as if they understood grief before they understood life. Their tiny voices filled the shelter with soft, desperate sounds while snow swirled violently outside the rear windows. Valor remained frozen beside the door, staring at the younger shepherd through the storm. Ethan could feel the weight of something invisible moving between the two dogs. Memory, blood, loss. The younger shepherd outside pulled harder against the leash again, paws digging into fresh snow while his handler struggled to steady him. Then the dog barked once more, sharp and emotional, and something inside Valor seemed to crack. The old shepherd stepped forward suddenly, limping toward the rear entrance with surprising speed despite exhaustion. "Valor," Claire whispered nervously. Ethan moved quickly beside him. "Easy." But Valor did not stop. He stood directly at the door now, staring into the storm with trembling focus. Ethan realized something then. Valor was not trying to protect himself. He was trying to reach the younger dog outside. The handler beyond the trees blew another short whistle command. The younger shepherd flinched instantly, but refused to look away from the shelter. His tail continued wagging anxiously through the snow. Ethan studied the man holding the leash. Mid-40s, heavy winter coat, calm posture. But there was hesitation in him now. He had expected obedience from the dog beside him. Instead, he was watching loyalty break apart right in front of him. Claire stepped closer quietly. "Those dogs were separated," she whispered. "Probably years ago." Valor let out another low whine toward the younger shepherd, softer this time, almost fatherly. The younger dog answered immediately. Ethan slowly unlocked the rear door, but kept one hand firmly on the handle. Freezing air burst inside, carrying snowflakes and the sharp scent of cedar. Valor took one careful step into the storm. Then another. The younger shepherd outside stopped struggling completely. His ears lowered. His entire body softened with recognition. The handler tightened his grip on the leash nervously. "Back," he ordered the younger dog sharply. The shepherd ignored him. Ethan noticed it immediately. The dog obeyed commands like a trained unit, but not this time. Not now. Valor moved closer through the snow until only a few feet separated them. The younger shepherd whimpered softly, tail wagging harder now. Then, with heartbreaking gentleness, Valor pressed his muzzle against the younger dog's face. The storm seemed to disappear for one silent moment. Claire wiped tears from her eyes while standing beneath the doorway light. "He remembers his father," she whispered. The younger shepherd closed his eyes briefly against Valor's muzzle, like a child finally finding home again after years lost. Ethan noticed something else then. The handler holding the leash looked away. Not cold, not cruel, guilty. Another SUV door opened near the parking lot. The tall man from earlier stepped forward through the snow, coat covered in ice crystals. "Enough," he called calmly. Valor immediately turned toward him and growled. Low, protective. The puppies inside the shelter began barking again in response. Tiny newborn voices answering the old shepherd's warning. The man stopped walking. Ethan stepped slightly in front of Valor instinctively. Snow collected along his shoulders while freezing wind whipped through the trees around them. "You need to leave," Ethan said firmly. The man looked past him toward the shelter windows glowing warm against the darkness. "You do not understand what those puppies are capable of becoming." Claire spoke from behind them, voice stronger now despite the fear. "They are living creatures, not experiments." The man sighed quietly, almost tired. "You think we created monsters. We did not." His eyes shifted toward Valor. "We created protectors." Valor stood motionless beside the younger shepherd now, both dogs facing the humans together beneath the falling snow. Then the younger dog slowly did something unexpected. He stepped away from the handler's side and moved beside Valor instead. Choosing him. Choosing family. The leash slipped from the man's frozen hand into the snow. Silence followed. Even the storm seemed quieter somehow. Then, from inside the shelter, one newborn puppy released a bark so loud and clear that everyone turned toward the doorway in disbelief. The tiny bark echoed through the storm like something far larger than a newborn puppy should have been capable of making. Everyone froze. Snow drifted sideways through the open rear doorway while the shelter lights flickered weakly against the darkness outside. Valor stood beside the younger shepherd, both dogs facing the building now with ears raised high. Inside the emergency room, one of the puppies had somehow pulled itself free from the blankets again. The smallest one, the puppy with the white cross marking across its chest. Claire moved toward him carefully, but the tiny shepherd ignored her completely. His sealed eyes remained closed as he barked once more toward the front of the shelter. Sharp. Focused. Warning. Ethan felt his chest tighten instantly. Something is wrong, he whispered. Almost immediately, the front lights inside the shelter went dead. Darkness swallowed the hallway. The old building groaned beneath the storm, while emergency backup power struggled to activate. For one breathless second, only the sound of snow and distant wind filled the night. Then Valor barked. Loud. Commanding. The younger shepherd beside him lunged toward the parking lot at the exact same moment. Ethan spun toward the front entrance just as the emergency lights flickered back on in dim red pulses. A shadow moved near the front office windows. Someone had entered the building during the blackout. Claire pulled Nova's puppies closer protectively, while Nova struggled weakly to stand despite exhaustion. Valor sprinted inside faster than Ethan thought possible for an aging dog. The younger shepherd followed immediately beside him. Both dogs moved through the hallway with terrifying precision, silent and focused, like instincts older than memory had awakened inside them again. Ethan followed close behind. Near the front office, the dim red emergency lights painted long shadows across the floor. A man stood near the reception desk, holding a small tranquilizer carrier case in gloved hands. He froze the moment he saw Valor. For a second, nobody moved. Then Valor stepped forward slowly into the red light. The old shepherd's body trembled with age and fatigue, but his gaze never wavered. The man looked down at him quietly. "You should have stayed gone," he murmured softly. Valor growled low in response. Not hatred. Hurt. The younger shepherd moved beside Valor protectively. 2 generations standing shoulder to shoulder beneath flickering emergency lights. Ethan stepped forward carefully. "It ends tonight," he said firmly. The man looked around the shelter slowly. Toward Nova. Toward the puppies. Toward Claire standing near the emergency room door with tears in her eyes. Then finally toward Valor again. Something softened inside his expression for the first time all night. Regret. "We told ourselves we were saving them," he whispered quietly. Snow hissed softly against the windows while silence settled over the room. The puppies had stopped crying now, all except the smallest one. The tiny shepherd continued staring toward the hallway with sealed eyes, listening to everything. The man slowly placed the tranquilizer case onto the floor. "The program is finished anyway," he said. "No funding. No handlers left." His voice lowered. "Only ghosts." Valor watched him carefully for another long moment. Then the old shepherd did something unexpected. He walked forward slowly and rested his muzzle gently against the man's hand. Forgiveness. Simple. Quiet. Human tears filled the man's eyes almost immediately. Outside, the storm finally began to weaken. By dawn, pale gold sunlight spilled gently across the snow-covered mountains surrounding Broken Pine's shelter. Nova slept peacefully beside her puppies while Valor rested nearby. The younger shepherd curled against his side like he had years ago as a pup. Ethan sat silently against the wall watching them all breathe beneath the warm morning light. For the first time in years, the weight inside his chest felt lighter. Not gone, just lighter. Claire wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and whispered softly, "Maybe some bloodlines are not meant for war." Ethan looked toward the sleeping puppies. Tiny paws twitching beside their mother. Tiny heartbeats beginning again. Then he smiled faintly and whispered, "Maybe they were always meant to teach people how to come home."